This is an introduction to the book of 1st and 2nd Kings from the Message translation of the Bible. Sovereignty. God's sovereignty is one of the most difficult things for people of faith to live out in everyday routines. But we have no choice. God is sovereign. God rules, not only in our personal affairs, but in the cosmos. Not only in our times and places of worship, but in the office buildings, political affairs, factories, universities, hospitals, yes, even behind the scenes in salons and rock concerts. It's a wild and extravagant notion, to be sure, but nothing in our scriptures is attested to more frequently or emphatically. Yet not much in our daily experience confirms it. Impersonal forces and arrogant egos compete for the last word in power. Most of us are knocked around much of the time by forces and wills that give no hint of God. Still, generation after generation, men and women of sound mind continue to give sober witness to God's sovereign rule. One of the enduring titles given to Jesus is King. So how do we manage to live believingly and obediently in and under this revealed sovereignty in a world that is most either ignorant or defiant of it? Worship shaped by an obedient reading of Scripture is basic. We submit to having our imaginations and behaviours conditioned by the reality of God rather than by what is handed out in school curricula and media reporting. In the course of this worshipful listening, the books of Kings turns out to provide essential data on what we can expect as we live under God's sovereign rule. The story of our ancestors, the Hebrew kings, began in the books of Samuel. The story makes it clear that it is not God's idea that the Hebrews have a king, but since they insisted, he let them have their way. But God never abdicated his sovereignty to any of the Hebrew kings. The idea was that they would represent his sovereignty, not that he would delegate his sovereignty to them. But it never worked out. After 500 years and something over 40 kings, there was not much to show for it. Even the bright spots, David and Hezekiah and Josiah, were not very bright. Human beings, no matter how well intentioned or gifted, don't seem to be able to represent God's rule anywhere close to satisfactory. The books of Kings, in that light, are a relentless exposition of failure, a relentless 500-year documentation proving that the Hebrew demand of God to have a king was about the worst thing they could have asked for. But through the centuries, readers of this text have commonly realized something else. In the midst of the incredible mess these kings are making of God's purposes, God continues to work his purposes and uses them in the work. Doesn't discard them, doesn't detour around them, he uses them. They are part of his sovereign rule, whether they want to be or not, whether they know it or not. God's purposes are worked out in the confirmation and revelation, in judgment and salvation, but they are worked out. God's rule is not imposed in the sense that he forces each man and woman in absolute conformity to justice and truth and righteousness. The rule is worked from within, much of the time invisible and unnoticed, but always patiently and resolutely there. The books of Kings provide a premier witness to the sovereignty of God carried out among some of the most unlikely and uncooperative people who have ever lived. The benefit of reading these books is enormous. To begin with, our understanding experience of God's sovereignty develops counter to all power-based and piety-based assumptions regarding God's effective rule. We quit spinning our wheels on utopian projects and dreams, following that we begin to realize that if God's sovereignty is never cancelled out by the so deeply sin-flawed leaders, kings, in both our culture and our church, we can quite cheerfully exult in God's sovereignty as it is being exercised, though often silently and hiddenly, in all the circumstantial details of the actual presence.